Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe. If you can support the museum, please think of backing us on Patreon or joining one of our membership schemes. Or if you watch to the end of this video, you'll be able to see how you can help the museum by buying items from our online shop.
This is the Churchill Mark IV. It's actually probably the most important tank in the Churchill hierarchy. Certainly the tank that most people remember as a Churchill. And the reason you can tell it's different from the others is by the cast turret. But let's go back a bit. The very first Churchills had a smaller turret mounting a 2-pounder gun. But they'd always wanted a 6-pounder in the Churchill. It just wasn't in production at the time the tank was first built. When they first introduced the new turret and the new gun, they wanted a turret for it which was within the weight limit of, 37 tons. I think the Churchill was in those days. And what they decided to do was have a welded turret. Now, they'd never had a welded turret before in anything. And people were beginning to say, well, welding's useless. It'll fall to bits the minute it's fired at. But Babcock and Wilcox, who were the welders up in Scotland, decided that they could produce a turret that was stronger in the welds than in the armour, and they did so. And that produced the Mark III Churchill. We've shown you that in the Churchill Avery, which had a Mark III turret on it, the welded turret. The trouble was that after a while, after they produced about 300 or 400 of them, the bulletproof plate people announced that they weren't able to produce any more of the metal needed to weld the turrets. So they had to change it. They didn't really want a cast turret. They decided to use a cast turret earlier and found it increased the weight of the tank too much. But gradually we got our casting act together, and having taken some lessons from the Americans, we were able to produce a turret like this one, which took a 6-pounder gun comfortably and also was within a reasonable, or with about a 1/4 ton difference between this and the other turrets. So it kept it more or less within the weight limit of the Churchill tank. And that's where this turret came from. It's a pure casting, it's all one piece, which is quite useful from the manufacturer's point of view. It's always a bit of a nuisance from the operator's point of view, because a casting is said to be a little bit ineffective than something made out of rolled plate. But there we are, they decided on it, and it never was a problem after that time. Now, the interesting thing is that when this turret came in, they were able to put a 6-pounder in. They originally put the Mark III 6-pounder, which had the shorter gun barrel, because that was the barrel used on British tanks. In the anti-tank gun, you could have a longer barrel, but in a tank, you had the Mark III gun. But they extended the gun to the Mark V gun, which was the same, really, as the towed version. And that's what this tank has got. It's got the Mark V barrel, which gives it that little bit of extra punch, which it needed. The 6-pounder was quite a good anti-tank gun, absolutely useless for firing high explosive. But that's the difference that these early guns suffered from. They were all good at the anti-tank role, because that's what they've been designed for. But for firing HE, they weren't as effective as they ought to be. But that's what they did. Now, another thing which isn't relevant in this case, was that all the tanks produced up to this time tended to keep the gun shorter than the overall length of the tank, because they were fearful that a gun longer than a tank would stick in the ground. If the tank went over a bump, the gun barrel stuck in the ground and that ruined it. So they always made sure that the gun was shorter than the tank itself. On the Churchill, this is quite possible. But that's why they did it. But later on, as we saw with the Sherman, they had a longer gun and they didn't worry about it. They found that keeping the gun elevated by mechanical means made it less likely to be clobbered on the ground. So that's why they did it. And with the Firefly and other tanks, they had a long gun and couldn't avoid it, because you needed a long gun with a higher velocity to take out the German tanks, particularly the Tiger. Interesting, the Churchill has 102 millimeters of frontal armour. Now on the Churchill, the frontal armour is fairly confined. It's only really the strip along the front with the driver and the machine gunner behind it. But it was 102 millimeters thick, which is actually thicker than the frontal armour on a Tiger, which is quite something most people aren't aware of. It meant that that was fairly well bulletproof from that point of view, but so small it hardly mattered. But that was part of the design. So that's what happened. You had the Mark IV tank with the cast turret. Incidentally, the cast turret would take the new 95mm howitzer. Now they developed that as a close support weapon because the old 3-inch howitzer, which they used to supply to tanks, was nearly useless by this time. But they managed to make the 95. Being British, they wouldn't make a new gun. That was horrible, wouldn't think of it. They cobbled the gun together from other bits and pieces. They used part of the barrel of a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, the breech of a 25-pounder, but they adapted the two to fire the round of a 3.7-inch howitzer. And from that they made the 95mm howitzer. It was put in a Churchill with a cast turret like this, well, it's very similar anyway, but as the Churchill Mark V. It was the close support version of this tank. The only drawback with it was that it was very limited in elevation. I think it only had an elevation of about 37 degrees, which is pathetic for a howitzer. It's quite effective in a tank. They also actually built a wheeled version of the 95mm howitzer, which had the endearing habit of falling over every time it was fired. So they cut that down straight away. But this is the Churchill Mark IV. The other thing that's outstanding and quite well shown on this one is the applique armour, which they added here to the sides and to the door. You can tell straight away that it's extra armour because it's got bolted on the outside to hold the armour in place, and it's just thickens up the armour on the side. You'll notice on the door, by the way, that the original hole, which was covered by a plug and was used as a pistol port, has been welded up. And that's, again, part of the upper armouring process. And that was done on the side of this tank. Otherwise, this is an ordinary Churchill. It's powered by a flat 12-cylinder Bedford engine, petrol engine, of course, driving through a Merritt Brown 4-speed or 5-speed, 4-speed in this case, gearbox, transmission to the back sprockets. Most British tanks had drive to the back sprockets in those days, and in that respect it's very like every other Churchill. It contains a crew of 5, that's a driver and a hull machine gunner and 3 men in the turret, namely the commander, the loader and the gunner, who all occupy the turret up there. The other interesting thing is that from the Mark III Churchill onwards, they've moved the coaxial machine gun to the left of the main gun. On an earlier version, a Mark I or a Mark II Churchill, you'll find the coaxial gun on the right of the main gun, but on this one it's been put over to the left. And it just means that the gunner now is responsible for firing the machine gun, not at the same time as the main gun, of course, while the loader has quite enough to do work in the radio. But that's another odd feature which you'll notice on this Mark of Churchill. They are quite a heavy, they come up to about 39 tons, which was still not unreasonable for a Churchill. They were slow with this kind of suspension. You'd expect them to be, but it was an infantry tank. It was geared to the speed of the marching or fighting soldier, and that was all they wanted. But it did mean that the tanks were fairly slow, usually about 10 or 12 miles an hour, and it took them a long time to get anywhere, whereas a Sherman would race ahead, and they were used for a different purpose in a way. But it rather goes against the argument that General Montgomery made about the universal tank. because the two tanks were complementary. The British had the slow-moving, heavily armoured infantry tank and the faster, lighter cruiser tanks, which worked perfectly well together. For some reason, we've been sort of castigated for using the term infantry tank, and the slow tanks which we built a lot of them, are not really favoured or weren't favoured worldwide. Now, the interesting thing is that most countries built a tank for the assault role, which was more or less like an infantry tank, heavily armoured, usually faster than the British, but the same sort of idea. But that was what was stuck behind the sort of theories behind the Churchill, was to use as much armour as possible and have the tank moving slowly, absorbing punishment and dishing out what it could in the way of firepower. Later on, the Churchill Mark IV was fitted with a 75mm gun. This is the basic Churchill tank in its most common form of all.
We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.